Welcome to my podcast, Scientist Free from Religion. This podcast has as proposal, as main idea to talk about a scientific topic, but also talk about religion. Different from the common assumption in which science and religion should be separated, here on this podcast we recognize formally that science and religion are not disconnected. Sadly, religion can be a very big threat to science. So on this podcast, the proposal is to talk about it freely, so without fear, without the illusion that they are separate topics. So we are going to cover a possible topic. Most of them will be focused on the connection between religion and science, especially to defend science. That's our goal. Our goal here is to defend science from religion and to help to make science, to spread scientific thinking, especially to defend it against religion.
Welcome to the Deep Dive. Our mission today is, well, to tackle something pretty bold. We're looking at a source that seems definitive, throws down this huge intellectual challenge, and we need to really pull it apart.
Right.
We're diving into a claim, and it's a highly provocative one, challenging the very bedrock of modern biology. The idea is that biological evolution is, quote, dead in the water of Darwin's warm little pond.
Yeah, and this isn't just, some random comment online. This claim was actually published in a peer-reviewed biochemistry journal, no less. Progress in Biophysics and Molecular Biology.
That's the surprising part, the journal.
Exactly. So when you see a source trying to basically dismantle the theory of evolution, something so foundational, and using arguments based on extreme probability and complex math, well, that really demands a closer look. We have to figure out not just what it's saying, but frankly, how it even got published.
Okay, so the paper is by Olin Brown and David Hollander. And even before you get into the details, just looking around online, the scientific community's reaction was, well, pretty strong.
Oh, absolutely.
Critics jumped on the tone straight away. Descriptions like dripping with disdain for naturalism came up. Some said it reads less like a scientific paper and more like a gotcha piece, maybe written by someone with a very strong opinion already.
And that reaction, that focus on the tone, that's actually a really important piece of context, isn't it? It suggests maybe this isn't just about the data.
Suggests an agenda.
It hints that maybe the driving force here isn't purely scientific curiosity or new evidence, but perhaps more of a philosophical or ideological viewpoint, trying to use mathematics as a sort of Trojan horse to get into the scientific conversation.
Okay, so for our deep dive today, we've got three main things we need to tackle. First, let's unpack what seems like the central, maybe fatal, logical flaw, this deliberate confusion between evolution and how life actually started, abiogenesis.
The origin of life, yeah, that's crucial.
Second, we need to scrutinize their main tool, this mathematical approach, which seems to heavily rely on what some call the improbability fallacy, those huge negative exponents.
Right, the math needs a close look at its foundations.
And finally, the big question hanging over all this, the institutional side. How does a paper, if it has these clear weaknesses in its logic and maybe its rhetoric, get through peer review? What does that tell us?
It's a question about the process itself.
Exactly. So this is really a deep dive into critical thinking, what scientific rigor actually means, and maybe even the vulnerabilities within academic publishing.
Okay, let's start right there with that first big issue, the foundational flaw. Because honestly, for anyone trained in biology, this is the immediate red flag. The whole argument against evolution in this paper hinges on a false premise.
Which is?
Their assertion, and they state it quite clearly, that biological evolution to be complete must include the origin of life. Abiogenesis.
Okay, let's really unpack that, because mixing those two up, evolution and abiogenesis, that seems like the strategic linchpin of their whole argument, doesn't it?
It absolutely is. Evolutionary theory, going back to Darwin descent with modification, natural selection acting on it, it's actually completely agnostic about how life first popped into existence.
So evolution describes the what happens next part.
Precisely. It's about the mechanisms of change after you have a system that can replicate, that can mutate, and where there's differential survival. The theory is focused entirely on how life changes over time. You could, hypothetically, believe life was created in distinct kinds, like some creationists argue.
Right.
But the moment those organisms started reproducing and varying, the whole engine of Darwinian evolution would kick in, regardless of the origin story.
So why the insistence on linking them? What's the advantage for Brown and Hollander in constantly conflating evolution with the origin of life?
Well, it's a pretty standard rhetorical strategy, actually, often used by people skeptical of evolution. See, evolutionary theory itself, it's incredibly robust empirically. The evidence for common descent, for macroevolution, it's overwhelming. It comes from genetics, the fossil record, comparative anatomy, everywhere you look. Abiogenesis, though, how life started from non-life. That's still an active area of research. It's complex, there are unknowns, it's a genuinely hard scientific problem involving chemistry and early Earth conditions.
Say they're shifting the goalposts.
Exactly. By insisting that evolution must also explain abiogenesis perfectly, right now they shift the burden of proof onto the hardest, maybe currently unsolvable part of the puzzle. It's basically saying, look, if you can't explain the absolute beginning perfectly, then this whole evolutionary process you talk about must be invalid.
That's a classic straw man argument then, trying to knock down a well-supported theory, evolution, by attacking a different, much harder research question, abiogenesis.
Perfectly put. And they focus specifically on this transition from non-life to what they term the first minimal cell. They argue that you need this complex assembly to reach some kind of modern-ish threshold before anything like survival of the fittest can even begin.
As if you need a fully functional iPhone before you can even have a basic calculator.
Sort of, yeah. They imply you need a complete modern-style cell, maybe with error correction and all the bells and whistles, just to get the evolutionary clock ticking. But the scientific consensus is quite different. It suggests that just replication itself, even messy, error-prone replication of simpler molecules like RNA, perhaps, is enough for natural selection to start acting. The complex cell we see today, that's likely a much later refinement.
And this initial framing, this demand for instant complexity,
Right.
it immediately biases their whole methodology, right?
Absolutely. They make this critical assumption right at the start that modern, highly complex biological parts, like an enzyme that needs specific cofactors to work, must have always required that exact full complex setup right from the very beginning.
That feels unevolutionary, like ignoring history.
It's fundamentally static and ahistorical. It completely dismisses the possibility, the likelihood really, that simpler, ancient versions of these enzymes existed and worked okay, maybe less efficiently, but worked without those cofactors. Or maybe the cofactors themselves were just available in the environment, products of basic geochemistry, not needing life to make them initially.
So if your starting point in your calculation demands modern complexity right out of the gate,
You've already guaranteed that the probability of it happening spontaneously will be vanishingly small. You've baked failure into the model.
okay, that leads us perfectly into the second point, the math itself. The improbability fallacy. They lean so heavily on these mind-bogglingly small probability numbers. You mentioned 1050, even 10400. This is where the paper tries to get its scientific weight, isn't it?
It is. It gives it that air of, mathematical certainty. But these numbers, however accurately calculated based on the assumptions, hide a really deep conceptual error.
Which ties back to that complexity argument.
Yes, fundamentally, it's recycling the old irreducible complexity idea, even if they don't use the exact term. The implicit demand is that complex biological systems say a specific functional protein had to just poof into existence all at once, perfectly assembled from their component parts, by random chance alone.
And to get those kinds of numbers, the 10400 type figures, they must be treating it like a series of incredibly unlikely, independent events that all have to happen perfectly in sequence.
That's exactly how they do it. Imagine building a specific protein, maybe 300 amino acids long, in a precise order. They calculate the odds of getting amino acid #1 correct by chance, then multiply that by the odds of getting #2 correct, and so on, for all 300 positions. Then maybe they add conditions like it has to fold perfectly into one specific shape, and maybe 10 other specific proteins have to assemble simultaneously nearby.
You're multiplying tiny fractions together over and over.
Exactly. You multiply probability by probability by probability until the final number is just absurdly small, smaller than the odds of winning every lottery on Earth simultaneously for millennia. They're forcing nature into these rigid, sequential, mathematical boxes.
But that just doesn't sound like how things actually happen in the real world. Nature doesn't seem to work in neat little sequential boxes or like start over from scratch every time something doesn't work perfectly.
Precisely. That's the core misunderstanding of the process. Real evolution, especially at the chemical level leading to life, and certainly biological evolution after, is continuous. It's accumulative. When some beneficial change happens, maybe a short chain of amino acids forms that has even a tiny bit of useful catalytic activity or helps stabilize something else, natural selection doesn't just throw it away because it's not perfect.
It keeps it.
It keeps it. That small advantage means the system carrying it might replicate slightly more or persist slightly longer. That gain is preserved. As one critic cleverly put it, evolution guards the lotto ticket. It takes that partial function, that slight advantage, and then builds on it incrementally. The math in the Brown and Hollander paper just fundamentally ignores this power of accumulation and selection acting on intermediate imperfect states.
This really sounds like that classic statistical mistake.
Yeah.
The post hoc probability fallacy. Or sometimes people call it the lottery paradox. Looking at the winner after the draw and saying, wow, the odds of that specific person winning were 1 in millions.
That is the absolute heart of the misuse of probability here. Let's use that golf ball analogy, but maybe slow it down a bit to see the flaw clearly. Imagine you hit a golf ball, right? It lands somewhere on a huge field covered in millions, maybe billions of blades of grass.
Good.
Now, what are the odds that the ball lands on one specific blade of grass that you picked out in your mind beforehand? Let's call it blade X. The probability is minuscule, practically zero.
Right. Almost impossible.
That's how Brown and Hollander calculate the odds of life forming. They're demanding life X, this one specific outcome we see now.
But that's not the right question to ask, is it? The relevant question isn't, what were the odds of hitting that specific blade X?
No. The relevant question is, what were the odds that the ball would hit some blade of grass? And since the entire field is covered in grass...
The odds are virtually 100% it had to land on some blade.
Exactly. So applying that back to the origin of life, the probability of any self-replicating chemical system emerging, given a planet like early Earth, which we know is rich in organic building blocks. These things are found on asteroids, they form in interstellar clouds, they were abundant. The probability isn't about getting us sitting here right now. It's about the probability of any form of chemical self-replication starting somewhere, sometime, from that immense chemical soup running countless simultaneous experiments.
So flipping it around, maybe the truly improbable thing would be if, given all those starting materials and all that time and energy, nothing like life ever got started anywhere.
That perspective makes life seem much less like statistical miracle and more like a likely, perhaps even inevitable, emergent property of the chemistry of carbon and water, given the right conditions. It changes the whole framing from demanding perfection to recognizing potential.
Okay, let's try and make this even more concrete. The paper takes aim at a specific, really fundamental biological process, the Krebs cycle, also called the citric acid cycle. This is core metabolism, right?
Absolutely central to how most complex life gets its energy, cellular respiration.
Yeah, and they claim this is irreducibly complex, that it couldn't possibly have evolved step by step. They calculate the odds of getting all its necessary parts, like 12 enzymes and 4 cytochromes, assembling simultaneously as astronomically low, that 1051 figure you mentioned.
Yes, they use the Krebs cycle as their big showpiece example of supposed unevolvable complexity. But again, the model they use completely crashes against empirical reality. It ignores what we actually know from evolutionary biochemistry and comparative genomics. Their core assumption is that the cycle had to spring into existence fully formed, fully optimized, all parts working together perfectly from the get-go.
And what does the actual biological world show us? Do we see evidence against this all-or-nothing requirement?
We absolutely do. It tells us that partial systems, incomplete versions, are not only possible, they exist and function right now today. Think about certain types of bacteria, like some species of mycoplasma or chlamydia. These are often obligate intracellular parasites. They live inside the cells of other organisms. Many of them lack a complete textbook Krebs cycle. They have bits and pieces, or they rely on alternative, sometimes truncated metabolic pathways. Or they simply scavenge energy intermediates directly from their host cell. This is living, breathing proof that the system doesn't need simultaneous, perfect assembly of all modern components to be viable. Imperfect, partial metabolic systems do function and persist in nature.
So the premise of their calculation is demonstrably false based on existing life.
Correct. And their critique also seems completely detached from the likely history of biochemistry. It ignores potential stepping stones. Specifically, there's no real accounting for the RNA world hypothesis.
Ah, right. The idea that RNA came before DNA and proteins as the main genetic and catalytic molecule, how does that impact the Krebs cycle argument?
It's a huge omission. The RNA world hypothesis suggests that many fundamental metabolic reactions, maybe even precursors to parts of the Krebs cycle, could have been catalyzed by RNA molecules, ribozymes, long before complex protein enzymes evolved. And look at the structure of key players in modern metabolism, many of the essential cofactors: ATP, energy currency, NAD+, and FADH2, electron carriers, coenzyme A.
What about them?
What do they all have in common chemically? They are all nucleotide derivatives. Their core structure involves components found in RNA.
So they look like chemical fossils,
Yeah.
relics from an earlier time.
Exactly. They're like molecular ghosts of an era when nucleotides and RNA were running the show. If these nucleotide-based cofactors were already present in the prebiotic soup, maybe even playing early catalytic roles as parts of ribozymes, then the evolutionary jump needed to get to protein-based enzymes using these cofactors becomes much, much smaller and more plausible.
It breaks down that demand for one giant simultaneous leap. Instead of needing 12 enzymes and 4 cytochromes and all the cofactors to appear at once.
Have a scenario where the cofactors might have been around first, maybe RNA catalyst did some early steps, and then protein enzymes gradually took over and refined the process. It turns that $10 to $51 probability problem into a much more manageable, stepwise chemical evolution problem.
This keeps coming back to the same underlying issue, doesn't it? The authors seem to be implicitly assuming that evolution has some kind of foresight, or that it's an engineer striving for perfection. They're treating it like it must choose only the best option at every single step.
That really is the core philosophical mistake driving their mathematical modeling. They're anthropomorphizing a process that is fundamentally blind, statistical, and deeply contingent on historical accidents. Evolution doesn't choose anything in the sense of making a decision. It's simply that variants that happen to be slightly better at surviving and reproducing in their current environment tend to leave more offspring. It selects for traits that are good enough for survival right now, not necessarily what's optimal in some abstract sense or what would be best for the future.
Can you give us some really striking examples of this good enough principle, where evolution has produced something that's clearly suboptimal, maybe even dangerous, but it persists anyway? That's where it gets counterintuitive and fascinating.
Oh, there are so many great ones. A classic, almost bizarre example is the Babirusa tusks. The Babirusa is a type of wild pig found in Indonesia. The male's upper canine teeth grow upwards, out through the snout, and then curve backwards, sometimes dramatically, towards its own skull.
Wait, towards its own skull?
Yes. If the pig doesn't manage to wear them down through fighting or rubbing, these tusks can continue to grow in that curve until they literally pierce the skull, potentially causing fatal infection or brain injury.
That sounds like objectively terrible design.
From a pure engineering safety standpoint, it is. But the trait persists. Why? Because those dramatic tusks are incredibly important for sexual selection. They signal fitness to females and are used in fights between males. The reproductive advantage they confer, on average, outweighs the risk of occasional catastrophic self-impalement for some individuals. Survival of the sexy enough, even if it's dangerous.
Wow. Okay, that's a powerful example of trade-offs. What else?
Think about human anatomy. Why is our lower abdomen, which houses really important organs like the intestines, liver, spleen, largely unprotected by the rib cage? It's a major vulnerability, right? A blow there can be devastating.
Yeah, seems like a design flaw compared to having full armor.
Full skeletal protection might seem better engineered for safety, but the trade-off is likely mobility, flexibility, maybe a lower energetic cost to build and carry that skeleton, and crucially for females, the space needed for pregnancy and childbirth. We didn't evolve for maximum armor plating. We evolved for a balance of traits that worked for our ancestors' lifestyle. Viability won over theoretical perfection.
Or consider traits that become problems only because our environment changed drastically.
Yeah.
Like the predisposition to type 2 diabetes in many populations, or common lower back problems.
Exactly. Our ancestors lived in environments where food was often scarce and high physical activity was mandatory. Genes that promoted efficient fat storage or a skeletal structure suited for constant movement were advantageous then. But stick those same genes in a modern environment with abundant calories and sedentary lifestyles.
And suddenly they become liabilities. Diabetes risk skyrockets. Backs ache from sitting. Evolution selects based on the past environment. It has no crystal ball for the future.
One more quick example. Small wings on flightless birds. Think penguins or chickens. Are those wings useless, half wings, just waiting for evolution to finish the job or get rid of them? Not at all.
Penguins use them for swimming, right? Powerfully.
Like flippers, exactly. And chickens use their small wings for balance when running, for courtship displays, maybe short bursts to escape predators. They aren't intermediate structures in the way the irreducible complexity argument implies. They are functional components serving a purpose right now, even if that purpose isn't flight. They are good enough and provide an advantage.
So the Brown and Hollander model, demanding this instant perfect Krebs cycle, is like saying only a fully functional 747 can exist,
Yes.
and ignoring the possibility of, say, a simple glider or even just a sycamore seed that can travel on the wind. It misses the entire spectrum of good enough solutions that biology actually uses.
That's a great analogy. It demands the endpoint perfection and ignores the messy, incremental, often clumsy journey that real biology takes. The messiness is the signature of evolution.
Okay, we've looked at the core logical flaw, mixing up evolution and abiogenesis. We've looked at the mathematical fallacy demanding impossible, simultaneous perfection. We've looked at the biological examples showing partial systems and good enough designs are real. So this brings us to the really big systemic question, the one that I think is crucial for anyone trying to navigate science information. If the flaws are this clear to biologists, how on earth did this article get published in what's supposed to be a peer-reviewed journal? What happened to the filter?
Right. This is where we shift from the scientific critique to the institutional one. And it's complicated, involving several factors working together. We need to look at the authors, the specific journal, and the mechanics of peer review itself.
Let's start with the context, the authors and the journal.
Okay. So the lead author, Olin Brown, isn't new to this. He has previous publications critical of evolution, and importantly, he's known to be associated with the Discovery Institute.
Hey there, thanks for being around. We are going to make a small break. I'm going to share with you my books. I have several books. So far, all my books about religion, atheism, which have been published a lot, they are in Portuguese, which is my main focus. But if you are interested, you can still buy my books to help me to support my work. I have several books. For example, one book that I'd like to recommend now is AI by Sci-Fi. AI by Sci-Fi is a book that talks about artificial intelligence, which is everyone is talking about artificial intelligence with ChatGPT, all this amazing stuff that they can do. They can talk, they can create video, they can create podcasts. This podcast, for example, there are several episodes that was recorded using artificial intelligence, which is amazing how I can do that. I can even interact as you could see in several episodes. So I would like to invite you to buy my book AI by Sci-Fi. It's available on Google Books, Google Play. It's also available on Amazon. So you can buy my book. If you are interested in something a little bit more complex, a little bit more technical, I do have as well technical book. For example, I have one book about computational thinking, in which I talk about Kasparov. It's a technical book. Greg Kasparov was the first guy to be beaten by a computer. He has a very nice book about that, how artificial intelligence overturned the difference between human and artificial intelligence. So please buy my book and offer me all the support. You can find all of them on Amazon. Hopefully, in the future, I'm going to write also about religion, atheism, and science. But I do have a podcast. I do have a blog called the Scientists Free from Religion. The same name of the podcast. And you can find several already publications about several topics in which talk about science, religion, and atheism. So, hope you enjoyed the show. So, let's come back to the show.
The Discovery Institute, that's the main hub for intelligent design advocacy in the U.S., isn't it?
It is. That's a significant affiliation. The co-author, David Hollander, comes from an engineering background, apparently dabbling in biology for this work. Then there's the journal, Progress in Biophysics and Molecular Biology. While it's peer-reviewed, it does have a reputation, maybe a niche, for publishing more speculative or controversial papers sometimes. It's not quite Nature or Science in terms of its mainstream impact, or perhaps rigor across the board. It has published papers on things like panspermia, for instance.
So choosing that specific journal might have been a strategic move. Knowing the gate might be a bit wider for unconventional ideas.
It certainly looks that way. It suggests they might have exploited a particular publishing niche. And this potentially ties into what you could call a closed-loop publication strategy.
A closed loop, what does that mean?
It's a tactic where authors, or a group of like-minded authors, publish multiple papers, often on related controversial topics, within the same journal, or maybe a small cluster of friendly journals. And crucially, these papers frequently cite each other, building on their own previous work published in that same venue.
So it starts to look like there's a growing body of research supporting the idea, but it's all referencing itself within a limited circle, like creating your own echo chamber with citations.
Precisely. And often, these journals are paywalled. This makes it harder for outsiders, other scientists, journalists, the public, to easily access all the papers in the chain, follow the citation trail, and critically evaluate the whole narrative being built. It creates this illusion of a self-validating scientific discourse while actually shielding the arguments from widespread, independent scrutiny. It gives a false sense of legitimacy.
That's clever in a manipulative way. But the core vulnerability they really seem to exploit was the paper's structure itself sitting right between mathematics and biology, using that interdisciplinary complexity as a kind of shield.
I think that's the absolute key to how it likely slipped through peer review. This paper is deliberately constructed to be dense. It's packed with complex mathematical equations, formal notation, probabilistic arguments. It looks incredibly technical and rigorous.
So imagine the review process.
Okay, you send it out for review. You might send it to a mathematician or a statistician. They look at the equations. Maybe the derivations are formally correct given the starting assumptions. They might say, well, the math seems sound. But they probably lack the deep biological expertise to recognize that the initial biological premises, like demanding the fully formed Krebs cycle instantly, are fundamentally flawed. They might not know about mycoplasma or the RNA world evidence.
And then you send it to a biologist.
The biologist reads the introduction and the biological arguments and immediately thinks, wait, this premise about abiogenesis and evolution is wrong, or this ignores existing partial Krebs cycles. They see the biological flaws, but then they hit this wall of dense mathematics, pages of equations. They might feel intimidated, thinking, well, I don't fully grasp all this complex probability theory, but it looks so technical. Maybe there's something mathematically profound here that I'm missing.
So they might defer, assuming the math part must have been checked in as okay, giving it the benefit of the doubt based on the apparent rigor.
Exactly. The paper gets this illusion of rigor because neither reviewer might feel fully equipped to critique the whole thing authoritatively. The review process gets fractured. Each expert validates their piece of the puzzle, but nobody might be perfectly placed to see how the flawed biology completely undermines the seemingly sophisticated math. The paper exploits the gap between disciplines.
And layered on top of that was the language they used. You mentioned rhetorical camouflage earlier. They were careful not to sound overtly religious or creationist.
That careful wording was absolutely essential for getting past the initial editorial screening and the reviewers. They didn't explicitly say evolution is wrong, therefore God designed life. That would likely lead to immediate rejection from any mainstream science journal.
So what did they do instead?
They used careful, seemingly neutral scientific-sounding language. Phrases like, the central thesis of this perspective is that reasonable scientific challenges should be explored. They talk about invoking scientific doubt about established theories. And crucially, instead of proposing a supernatural designer, they hint at the need for something like a fifth type of force in nature to explain life's complexity.
So that sounds like legitimate scientific speculation proposing new physics, but it functions as a way to argue that current materialistic science, physics, chemistry, biology, is insufficient.
Precisely. It allows them to push a conclusion that leans towards non-material explanations, maybe even subtly pointing towards design, but under the guise of just identifying gaps in current scientific understanding and proposing purely naturalistic, albeit unknown, forces. It's a way to infiltrate a metaphysically motivated critique into the scientific literature by dressing it up in the language of technical skepticism.
Okay, authors, journal niche, interdisciplinary complexity, rhetorical camouflage. Is there one more piece? The editor.
Yes, we really can't ignore the editor factor. The journal's editor at the time, or at least a prominent figure on the editorial board for a long period who likely handled such papers, was Dennis Noble.
Dennis Noble.
Yeah.
He's a very distinguished physiologist, isn't he? Systems biology.
Highly respected, yes. But he's also known for being quite critical of the standard neo-Darwinian synthesis of evolution. He champions ideas sometimes grouped under the banner of the third way of evolution, arguing that evolution involves more complex mechanisms than just random mutation and natural selection, things like developmental constraints, systems dynamics, maybe even some forms of non-genetic inheritance.
So he's open to challenging the mainstream view of evolution.
He's definitely open to and actively promotes critiques of the standard model. Now, this doesn't mean he endorses intelligent design or the specific conclusions of the Brown-Hollander paper, but his known receptiveness to challenges, his position that the current synthesis is incomplete, likely created an editorial environment where a paper framed as a technical, mathematical critique of evolutionary mechanisms might get a more sympathetic hearing than it would elsewhere.
He might have seen it as stimulating debate, even if he didn't agree with the premise.
Possibly. His role as an influential editor, a gatekeeper in the publish or perish world of academia, could have, perhaps unintentionally, facilitated the publication of these kinds of papers. It highlights how the personal perspectives and intellectual interests of editors can significantly shape the content and direction of a journal. The paper might have been accepted not because its core claims were validated by reviewers, but because it was packaged effectively as a technical challenge to the status quo, fitting the editor's interest in fostering debate about evolutionary theory's foundations.
What a fascinating breakdown of how the system can be, well, gamed, or at least how its vulnerabilities can be exploited. So, after pulling all this apart, what's the big takeaway for you, for our listeners, when encountering these kinds of seemingly scientific challenges to major theories?
I think the biggest takeaway is that we have to constantly remember that models are not reality, and mathematical elegance doesn't automatically equal truth. This deep dive really shows that the claim about evolution being dead in the water rests entirely on mathematical models that oversimplify biology. They strip away the contingency, the messiness, the accumulation, the good enough reality of life, simplifying it to the point where the model is just false.
The math might be technically correct based on its own flawed rules, but the rules don't match the game being played in nature.
Precisely. The calculations might be performed rigorously, but if your foundational assumptions, the inputs you feed into that mathematical machine, are based on a misunderstanding or misrepresentation of the biology, then the output, no matter how impressive the negative exponent, is ultimately meaningless. It's garbage in, garbage out. Biology is fundamentally an empirical science, grounded in observation of the real world, and no abstract mathematical model can just invalidate the sheer weight of converging evidence from fossils, genetics, anatomy, and everything else we see.
And the other critical lesson seems to be about peer review itself. We hold it up as the gold standard, but this shows it's not infallible.
It's absolutely essential. It's our best filter. But it's not a magic bullet guaranteeing validity. It's a human process with potential weaknesses, especially as we saw it here when papers are complex cross-disciplinary lines and maybe when there are underlying ideological agendas learning how to navigate the system. We can't just accept something because it's peer-reviewed. We still need to apply our own critical thinking.
And specifically, look past the intimidating surface, the complex equations or technical jargon, and really zeroes in on the assumptions. What is the model actually assuming about the world? Is that assumption justified by evidence?
That's where the real scrutiny needs to happen. And in this case, the critique ultimately fails because it tries to impose human concepts, purpose, design, a demand for perfection onto a process that is inherently blind, statistical, and works with whatever history gives it. If evolution actually was forced to only select the absolute best, most perfect option at every single tiny step, eliminating anything remotely suboptimal,
It might have gotten stuck.
it probably would have. It might never have gotten past simple chemical replicators, constantly waiting for that statistically impossible, perfect 10-400 assembly to happen all at once. It would likely stall, trapped by its own impossible standards.
That is a really interesting final thought. The idea that the very imperfection we see in biology, the clumsy designs, the suboptimal traits, the things that are just good enough to get by, isn't evidence against evolution, but is actually evidence for the messy, contingent, real process. What does that inherent messiness, the success of the good enough, tell you about the surprising robustness and the sheer resilience of life's actual evolutionary path? Maybe perfection is fragile, but good enough endures.
Something definitely worth mulling over.
Indeed. That's certainly food for thought until our next deep dive.
Hey there, you arrived to the end of this episode. You can always check out my YouTube channel and also keep watching because there are 7 episodes. So you just if you enjoyed this one, hopefully you are going to enjoy the next one. I always like to remember that you can support my work by buying my books. Even though I still don't have a book about religion, which is the main topic of the podcast, I do have a book about artificial intelligence. And also I have a blog called Scientists Free from Religion on Medium. And there are several blog posts there. And you can enjoy it, you can read it. And you can subscribe to my YouTube channel, you can share it with your friends. So hopefully I can hear from you and hope you had an amazing time. So hope to see you in the next episode.